He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
The kaumātua draws his blanket around him. His deeply tattooed visage lighting up with interest, he extends his bare arm towards the lake, and the oracle of the rocky mountain, Maunga Pohatu, speaks.
E pai ana e hoa. Now that Hine Pukohurangi is descending from her ancient love, our ancestor Te Maunga, whom she lured to earth in the days of long ago, and here among the silent homes of the ancient people, it is well that I should tell you the legends of the sea of the rippling waters, for that is why I followed you through the dark forests and across the snowy mountains.
This was a moment Elsdon Best had barely dared to dream of. This amateur ethnologist had spent years seeking out Māori elders who could tell him the history and beliefs of their people before European colonisation. He'd found many willing to speak to him, but none with the level of knowledge of this kaumātua.
You have Best, the ethnographer, putative anthropologist, and you have Tūtaka Nahau, the native expert, the informant, come together on this island in the middle of the wilderness.
And he had one mission in mind at that time, and he did it well. He did it with patience, and he did it in a way that did not offend the people that he wrote about. How did he do that?
Kia ora, ko William Ray tēnei, no mai ngā hipi pāngo. Welcome to Black Sheep in our second episode on Elsdon Best, the self-taught anthropologist described in his own time as a chief and father of the Māori race, and by some in more modern times as a structurally racist bigot who misinterpreted stolen information to perpetuate damaging myths. Last episode, we traced Elsdon Best's early life, growing up in close contact with Māori and Tawa, ditching a cushy office job in Wellington for a life of adventure in the bush, participating in the horrors of parihaka, and then sailing off on a somewhat chaotic working holiday in the United States. By the time we left Best, it was 1892. He was back in Aotearoa and had become a founding member of the Polynesian Society, a group dedicated to recording and publishing information about Māori history and culture. And in 1896, this association with the Society would give Elsdon Best the opportunity of a lifetime. Here's Hemana Waka of Ngai Tūhoe, who produced a documentary on Best for Whakaata Māori.
He was tasked to assist the surveyors build a road from Rotorua to Waikare Moana.
This road had to pass through the rugged mountains of Te Urewera, home to Ngai Tūhoe,
which at that time was absolutely a no-go area for surveyors.
There were plenty of members of Tūhoe who could remember the Crown's scorched earth campaign through Te Urewera in the 1870s in pursuit of the Ringatu leader Te Kōti. You can imagine how they felt about the government building a road through their land. Back in Wellington, one of the people tasked with negotiating these tensions was Percy Smith, Elsdon Best's old mate from his time in the Armed Constabulary. Smith, by this point, had been appointed Surveyor General, and he knew he needed someone he could trust on the ground, someone who could win respect from Tūhoe leaders and was tough enough to survive the rough and ready life out in the bush. The guy he picked was, of course, Elsdon Best. Here's Geoffrey Holman, author of the biography Best of Both Worlds.
So he was the paymaster, the man who looked after the orders for all the tools, equipment to dig the road, the wages, this sort of thing.
But Percy Smith had another reason for sending Elsdon Best into Te Urewera.
Because there was no such thing as a kind of government anthropologist at that point. The idea of appointing him there and his wanting to go there was so that he could go and talk to and explore and discover more about Māori in all respects.
So Best packed up his swag and made his way to Fort Galatea on the northeastern fringe of Te Urewera. By this point, some Tūhoe rangatira had reached a tentative agreement with the government about building this road, and had even provided some men to help construct it. Elsdon Best made a point of talking to these Tūhoe workers, asking them to share histories and songs and stories, and jotted it all down in his notebook.
This got through reasonably quickly to Tūhoe, and he made a point of going down and meeting Best.
Tūhoe was the senior rangatira of the community at Mangapohatu, the sacred mountain of Tūhoe. Like many Māori leaders of his time, Tūhoe was anxious to protect his land and people from Pākehā encroachment. But he was also enthusiastic about the opportunities this road might bring. He's an interesting and complex character in his own right. Jeffrey Holman's book is actually a joint biography of both Elsdon Best and Tūhoe, so check it out if you're interested in learning more.
You know, their mutual need of each other kind of found its beginnings up there as a part of a roading project.
Tūhoe was intrigued by Elsdon Best. Unlike many missionaries and government agents he had met over the years, Best seemed to have no interest in telling Māori how to live. Instead, he wanted to learn more about them. He wanted to know their histories and ways of life, things which he thought were on the brink of being lost forever.
This stirred people like Best to try and record what was being lost. And Tūhoe, he had the same anxieties, but for different reasons, right?
Unlike Elsdon Best, who you'll remember believed Māori were doomed to extinction, Tūhoe believed his people would survive contact with Pākehā. What he feared might become extinct was their culture, especially the detailed tribal knowledge which was held by a relatively small number of senior rangatira. A bad outbreak of influenza or other introduced disease might see that information lost forever.
Tūhoe, and not only him, but many others, wanted to preserve their stories, their history, their culture, their ancestral mana, because they saw it being rapidly, swallowed up by the invasion of the Pākehā. If he didn't find someone to be his amanuensis, his scribe, not only get it recorded, but get it preserved, then what was going to happen?
To be clear, Tūhoe was fully literate in his own language, as were many Māori of his generation, which slightly begs the question, what did he need Elsdon Best for?
Okay, have you ever tried to get a book published?
No.
If you think it's difficult now, how much more difficult do you think it would be then for Māori in general? Who was going to publish their books? So he and Best formed a relationship of mutual benefit.
But the decision to share this information with Elsdon Best wasn't made lightly. The first step in their relationship came when Tūhoe offered to guide Elsdon Best from Fort Galatea through the mountains of Te Urewera to Lake Waikaremoana. Best would later write about this voyage in a book which was essentially a kind of tourist guide. It's called The Sea of Rippling Waters, which is the English translation of Waikaremoana.
The scene before us is magnificent, for the waters of the lake, with a slight ripple thereon, are flashing in the rays of the morning sun. The green and beautiful forest sweeps up from the very water's edge to the peaks of the great ranges.
But right at the beginning, Elsdon Best makes it clear that he wasn't really going on this trip just to admire the views.
There comes that strange sensation of vivid interest and pleasing anticipation which is felt by the ethnologist, botanist, and lover of primitive folklore when entering on a new field for research. For the glamour of the wilderness is upon him, and the kurahuna, the concealed treasure of knowledge, loometh large in the land of Tūhoe.
And this is really what this book is about. All the stuff about beautiful lakes and trees and mountains, it's just a side note for Elsdon Best. What he's really interested in is the histories and legends which Tūhoe shared with him as he made this voyage to the lake.
Oro Mai Take, another old Māori fort, is on the spur yonder, whence the warriors of Kihi fled from the men of Tawhaki after their futile attack on Te Hikapā. And so on, and so on. Every hill and gulch and streamlet having its tale to tell.
Best trekked on through those streams and gulches, listening with rapt attention to Tūtakanaho. A group of fit young men trailed after them, carrying their food and tents. Eventually, they began the steep climb to the peak of Huiarau.
As we rise to the summit, we find the snow lies deep and has obliterated all signs of the trail. The summit is covered with a dense growth of scrub, growing strong and close. The kaumātua, however, never seems to be at fault, but trudges on barefooted with a serene indifference through the ice-cold snow.
Then, finally, they saw it. The shimmering waters of Waikaremoana. The travellers paused for a moment to take in the view.
The silence is broken by the mournful sound of a native tangi. Standing alone upon the cliff brow, the kaumātua rests upon his staff, and looking down upon the well-remembered scene below him, chants a long wailing lament for his old comrades, who have passed on to the reinga, for his ancestors who dwelt and fought here in the long ago.
Elsdon Best recorded this tangi in full in his book. The version you're hearing now comes from Hemanawaka's documentary. Best and Tūtakanaho made their way down to the lake, then took a waka along the shore till they reached a bay called Waiōpawa, where they made camp. Once the tents were pitched and the fire was lit, Tūtakanaho sent away the young men who'd come with them, so he could speak to Best alone. Here's how Elsdon Best recorded what was said.
Friend, it is well that we are alone, for my children who go with us have little love for the gallant stories of old, and I will tell them to you, and to one other and no more, that you may preserve these traditions of my people and record their customs, that they may be retained in the world of light. And you write them plainly in your paipera, your Bible, that all who love such things may understand. For I would even hope that my children may yet return to the kura of Tūhoe and of Potiki, and be proud of the achievements of their ancestors. Tēnā.
And in the flickering warmth of that fire, on the shores of Lake Waikaremoana, Tūtakanaho spent hours telling Elsdon Best some of the histories and legends of Tūhoe.
And that's his first book, in which you see something of his character, but also something of Tūtakanaho's character as well. He wrote many, many things on various subjects about information he'd received about fishing, about hunting, about beliefs, all sorts of things, using conversations, kōrero, that he'd had with Tūtakanaho and other Tūhoe elders. But that book is kind of the foundation of his writing career.
But as Hemanawaka points out, gathering this material from Tūtakanaho and other Tūhoe rangatira wasn't always easy.
And to get their trust was a big thing.
Hemanawaka says one of these kaumātua actually decided to test Elsdon Best to make sure it was worth spending all this time talking to him.
Well, one of them decided, we'll take the whakapapa this way. And then the next day when he came back to continue with the whakapapa, they went this way. And then Elsdon Best said, well, hang on, yesterday you said the whakapapa was this way. Why have you decided to go this way? The response was very simple. We just wanted to see if you're writing it down properly.
See if he'd noticed.
Because when you write in the whakapapa in Māori and the names, it takes a while.
So Elsdon Best passed that test, but it still wasn't easy going.
The second area was the patience of these old people that he interviewed. They gave him as much information as they could, but sometimes they would get tired of asking the questions being asked, especially when it comes to whakapapa.
Best remembered how one kaumātua in particular would just throw up his hands in frustration and storm out of the tent whenever Best was too slow in recording his words or made a mistake. He'd have to go walk around in the bush until he'd calm down enough to keep talking.
So what he did was he designed shorthand Māori and enabled it to go a little bit quicker. That was one of the amazing things that he had done in terms of writing the book.
But even with that shorthand, people often got fed up with Best. They could see this Pākehā was intelligent and curious and well-meaning, but he was also an outsider, ignorant of things which they took for granted. People were constantly having to correct him for breaches of tikanga, hanging meat at the entrance of his tent, smoking his pipe where he shouldn't, washing himself with a piece of soap which had been used for scrubbing pots and pans. This wasn't just bad manners. From a Tūhoe perspective, Best was undermining his own personal tapu, which was a serious issue for someone being entrusted with spiritually charged knowledge. And while Elsdon Best sometimes moaned about the difficulties living according to Māori rules and wrote disparagingly of certain Māori customs, he could see things from their perspective as well.
Of a verity have my sins been many in bringing down misfortune upon the heads of myself and friends. Yet I would fain hope that sometime in the distant vista of future I may know something of the Māori, his beliefs and strange customs.
This is what Elsdon Best most wanted from his discussions with Tūhoe rangatira. The thing he said loometh large in the land of Tūhoe. The kurahuna, the secret knowledge held only by the most senior members of the community. The problem was that this secret knowledge was, secret.
You will find it quite easy to obtain volumes of notes of ancient Māori mythology, the doings of the heroes of the Māori Dark Age. But when you come to seek true knowledge of Māori religion, more especially of sacred rites and the most ancient non-animistic conceptions of the beginnings of things and gods, it is then you will lift an unlighted trail. For the Māori will have business around the corner about that time, or he will close up like a sea anemone when you prod at it.
But it's no wonder people were closing up when Best prodded at them. From their perspective, what he was asking for was incredibly dangerous. What if a sheet of paper containing this information was allowed to fall on the floor and accidentally trodden on? What if it was left lying in a place where food was being prepared? This could constitute a major breach of tapu, something traditionally believed to cause illness, misfortune, maybe even death. Just to give an idea of how serious this was, there are accounts of rangatira who are considered so tapu they couldn't feed themselves with their own hands. They had to get someone to feed them using a long stick to avoid spiritual contamination.
He wasn't allowed access to it. He was going into another domain where he was absolutely forbidden to even talk about it, around the campfires or anything like that. He was going into a world, an unknown Wairua world. There are only certain people get into that world, and he was not one of them.
One of the reasons he was denied access was pretty simple.
He didn't believe in it. And because he didn't believe in the Māori gods, well, why are we telling you this? Why would we want to bring you in? The answer was no.
Elsdon Best wasn't willing to accept that answer, so he kept on prodding. And he did eventually publish several papers and books discussing Māori gods and religion. These writings were generally accepted in Pākehā society at least as being an accurate and comprehensive account of traditional beliefs gathered from Māori experts in Te Urewera and elsewhere. Best was literally described in one article, which was written 5 years after his death, as the white tohunga of Tūhoe land. These days, that's a more controversial label. And the question of how much Best actually knew about Māori religion is also somewhat controversial. Firstly, there are people who will say that Elsdon Best only ever obtained fragments of information about Māori religion. Hema Nawaka, for one.
Whatever little bit he would have got would have been just hearsay, not the actual vocabulary that he would have wanted. No.
There are also people who argue that basically everything Best ever published on this subject, and on other subjects, religion, history, technology, was all obtained under essentially false pretences. That Elsdon Best was, in effect, a thief. I put that idea to Mātua Waka.
One of the things people say about him now is that he stole this knowledge that he wrote about. I mean, do you think that's fair to describe it that way?
In the Pākehā world, yes. In the Māori world, no. The information that was given to Te Aopehi from our ancestors was from the heart. You can't pay money for your heart of information. Selling is unheard of. The knowledge I give you came from my heart and from my head for you to write as a Pākehā so that the people will read and know who we are with our own indigenous rights, our own language, our own customs. To suggest that it was a stolen language, no, I would defy that. I would debate that, and I'm sure so would my other academic colleagues today.
I put the same question to Jeffrey Holman.
There are all sorts of constructions you can put around this whole idea of him thieving things, as if he'd gone into their houses and stolen books out of their library. And some people would say, well, yes, he did. He went into their mental houses, he went into their brains, their hearts, their minds, and stole things for his own benefit. And you could argue that, and some would. I don't. I think he probably did it for all. I think he did it for Māori and for Pākehā and for himself. He obviously was a man with ambition, and we all have ego. I think one of the things you could argue about Best is when people criticise, well, what do you want? Would you rather not have had him? I'd like to hear the answer of some people to that question. Would you rather Best had not existed?
Interestingly enough, at least according to Elsdon Best's great-nephew, Elsdon Craig, who wrote a biography of his famous ancestor, there were a few Tūhoe tohunga who would have preferred that Elsdon Best never existed, and who actually tried to end his existence.
These tohunga were horrified to discover that Best possessed genealogies of nearly every member of the tribe. He had only to combine these with certain magic spells he had acquired to annihilate the community. Here surely was a legitimate reason to get rid of him. One night, he was riding from Fort Galatea to Te Whaiati when a shot rang out and a bullet whined close overhead. He tried to treat the incident something trivial, perhaps even a case of mistaken identity. But the warnings of his friends convinced him that an attempt on his life had been made.
These Māori friends offered physical protection and also gave him several taonga they said would protect him from supernatural attempts on his life. Best later wrote this about the incident.
They had what appeared to them to be good reasons for so doing, and we must judge them according to their lights. I have never met more genuine friendship than among my brown friends, nor have I ever found a people who would sacrifice more for those whom they loved.
The relationship between Elsdon Best and his Māori friends strengthened over the years. Maybe the most touching and the most tragic moment in this relationship was the death of Tūtakanaho's moko, mawere I te rangi. Tūtakanaho had put Mārewa and some other young relatives under Best's care while they attended a government-run school. Essentially, he was treated as a foster father. But, as happened so often in this period of New Zealand history, closer contact with the European world came with fatal consequences. That winter, influenza swept through the district, and many of the children at the native school became sick. Best heard that Mārewa was calling for him, asking for him to bring her food. Here's how Elsdon Craig tells the story.
When he came, she could not eat the food he brought, nor could she recognise him when he spoke to her. He was deeply touched by her instinctive affection for him, and as he mopped her fevered brow, he blamed himself for being Pākehā and inflicting such misery on a people who had never sought the doubtful benefits of his civilization.
After a few more days, Elsdon Best was called to Mārewa's bedside and invited by her father to join the whānau in saying the traditional words of farewell as she died.
And that really broke Tūtakanaho's heart, because he had to take that niece, take her all the way back to Mauna Pohatu, to lie in peace.
Elsdon Best was invited to join in the voyage to Mauna Pohatu and participate in the tangihanga. He was expecting to be blamed for Mārewa's death, but he was surprised to find that he was instead welcomed with open arms. One night, as he was unable to sleep, shivering in the cold, he recalled how a kuia gave him her own blanket for warmth. And when the ceremonies came to a close, Mārewa's parents gifted him many of their daughter's belongings, including a korowai and ornaments made of pounamu. If you're getting the impression that Best is effectively becoming part of the whānau, becoming what we might call Pākehā Māori, well, Tūhoe might have been open to that, but Elsdon Best wasn't. Here's what his great-nephew Elsdon Craig wrote on the subject.
He lived with the Māori rather than as a Māori. Certainly, he was no Pākehā Māori in the sense of abandoning his own standards for those of a people in a lower cultural stage.
In some ways, Elsdon Best must have been a very lonely man. He had Māori friends, but he held himself apart from them. He also had some Pākehā acquaintances in the road building camp, but he held himself apart from them as well. None of them shared his appreciation or interest in the Māori world. But in 1902, Best's loneliness came to an end. That year, while he was fording a stream near his campsite, Best's horse bolted and threw him from the saddle. A woman named Adelaide Wiley, a teacher at the native school, heard his screaming and found him writhing in pain in the water with a broken leg. Elsdon Craig picks up the story.
For many weeks he was laid up. During this time, nobody was more attentive to his needs than Adelaide. Whether it was by encouraging his interest in the Māori, or by taking appetising meals to his sickbed, she showed herself to be the staunchest of companions. And their impending marriage was announced soon after Best's return to his lowly camp.
On the stern advice of his sisters, and with help from a few Māori friends, Best said goodbye to the one-man canvas tent he'd been calling home for the past 5 years, and built a small weatherboard hut for himself and Adelaide to live in. One of his friends in the Polynesian Society, Te Rangihiroa, also known as Sir Peter Buck, visited Elsdon and Adelaide the following year, and later wrote this.
Through all the strenuous years in the Urewera country, she accompanied him through camp and field. She was the perfect helpmate and comrade, for she was imbued with the same high spirit which brushes aside personal inconvenience and discomfort for the sake of the quest.
The quest, as always, was obtaining more knowledge from Tūhoe elders. But all this time, Elsdon Best also had a day job, helping to build that road through Te Urewera. But according to Elsdon Craig, he became increasingly uneasy about his role in linking Tūhoe to the Pākehā world.
He saw the road as a monster, creeping stealthily about the cliff faces, eating its way not only into the heart of the country, but also into the heart of the people.
But this ambivalence didn't stop Elsdon Best from taking another job which extended the reach of the government into the heart of Tūhoe lands. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, he served as secretary of the Urewera Commission, helping bring the region under the jurisdiction of the Native Land Court.
Elsdon Best became the translator when they established Te Urewera Māori Land Court. Because all those people come to the court to do their whakapapas, well, who was going to write a translator for the courts? Elsdon Best did that.
Best enjoyed his work with the Commission. It gave him the opportunity to record copious amounts of new material from kaumātua who recited histories of their hapu to reinforce their claims to land. Many of these Tūhoe rangatira, including Tūtakanaho, initially hoped the court would help protect them from the loss of land. But of course, as we've discussed in previous episodes of Black Sheep, the court only acted to speed up that process of alienation. And whatever his personal views, Elsdon Best played a part in that.
His being able to translate whakapapa enabled the Māori land courts to divide up our land.
When work on the road and with the Commission dried up in 1903, Best still wasn't ready to leave Te Urewera. He eventually landed a job as a Māori health inspector and welfare officer. Elsdon Craig says he was initially enthusiastic about this job. He figured it was a good way to pay back all the help and support he'd received over the years from his Tūhoe friends. He was especially anxious to lift some of the burden of disease, which he saw just devastating entire communities.
No greater menace to health existed than the almost total absence of latrines. An efficient latrine had once ranked highly in the old Māori society, but the coming of civilization had swept it away with many other desirable features of primitive life, without providing an effective substitute.
His solution was to encourage Māori to adopt European technology, medicines and ways of living. But not everyone was willing to go along with his ideas. Elsdon Craig, probably echoing the attitude of his ancestor, put it like this.
The principal barrier against breaking down dangerous superstition lay with the authority of the tohunga. They were often charlatans who kept alive the old spiritual beliefs as a source of easy profit, insisting on the efficacy of the old tribal gods and claiming to use their powers of sorcery and witchcraft to cure every known malady. Best was aware that superstition, though interesting ethnologically, was dangerous sociologically.
So, Elsdon Best lobbied for these tohunga to be outlawed. He convinced the local Māori council to pass rules imposing a £10 fine on anyone offering supernatural healing. He was also a firm supporter of the 1907 Tohunga Suppression Act, which had a similar objective at a national level. Very few people were ever convicted under this law, but it did have the effect of driving traditional Māori healers and a lot of traditional Māori knowledge holders underground, and, at least in some cases, discourage them from passing their knowledge to the next generation. It's one of those uncomfortable contradictions of Elsdon Best. He is a man who devoted much of his life to preserving Māori traditions through writing. But he's also a man who in some ways fought to destroy those very same traditions in the actual physical world. Best's greatest nemesis among the tohunga was someone who we've talked about previously on Black Sheep, the Tūhoe prophet Rua Kinana. Best wrote about Rua publicly in some of the most vicious terms you can imagine. In one 1905 newspaper article, he pointed out how a similar indigenous religious movement in the United States
did not flourish long, but died with great suddenness of lead poisoning.
So a not particularly veiled suggestion that Rua and his followers should be rounded up and shot. Maybe a joke, but a pretty brutal one. Part of Elsdon Best's dislike of Ruakenana was his claim to perform miracle healings. But Geoffrey Holman says there's another reason. The same thing he'd despised about the leaders at Parihaka 25 years earlier.
He was hostile to Christianity per se, right? And so Māori cult, as he saw it, basing itself on the scriptures, prophetic books of the Old Testament, he would have seen them as not genuinely Māori, for one thing, right? Because they've been infiltrated, had their thoughts, their traditional Māori way of being changed by adopting this book of fairy tales, which he dismissed anyway. He didn't have any time for the Bible. Okay, but he particularly didn't like Ruakenana because he was a charismatic figure who drew people after him.
One of the people who Rua drew in was Tūtakanaho. In a letter to Percy Smith, Best said,
Old Tūtakangaho of Maunga Pohatu is fast losing his memory and has also embraced the cult of the new Messiah.
Now, neither Geoffrey Holman nor Herman Waka accept Elsdon Best's suggestion that Tūtakanaho supported Ruakenana because he was going senile. Instead, they argue this chief was looking for a new way for his people to survive in what was a rapidly changing world. But that change wasn't something Elsdon Best could appreciate.
He didn't want Māori to change. He had found them, he had discovered them, he had written about them, and he wanted them to stay that way.
Matua Waka says you can see a really clear example of this a few years after Best had left Te Urewera, when one of Tūtakanaho's sons visited Best on a trip to Wellington. When he came to Best's house, this son was dressed up for a meeting in Parliament, tailcoat, bowler hat, the whole 9 yards.
And then when he knocked on the door, the very first words, exclamation should I say, that Elsdon Best said to Tūtakanaho's son was this: "Good God, man, what have they done to you?" What does that tell you? He didn't want to see the change. He wanted to see his son still in his native garments and that. And that was the ideology. The Māori that he knew, he didn't want to change because he had fell in love with the culture of how he grew up with the culture. And I think he just wanted to leave it like that. He did not want Tūhoe to change or to adapt to a new world.
To Elsdon Best, Māori who changed to adapt to a Pākehā world weren't real Māori anymore. He dismissed them as, and I quote, brown paper cutouts. The rise of Ruakenana and the loss of his close friendship with Tūtakanaho spelled the end to Elsdon Best's time in Te Urewera. He rode out from Fort Galatea for the final time in 1910 with dreams of buying a farm. When he realised he didn't actually have enough money for that, he considered going back to work as a bush contractor. Bit of a daunting prospect given he was now in his mid-50s. But thanks to his friends in the Polynesian Society, he instead managed to land a job at the Dominion Museum in Wellington, where, for the very first time, he was employed as a professional anthropologist. Elsdon Best spent most of the final 20 years of his life hunched over his desk, pen in hand, scouring through his old shorthand notes of korero with all the people he'd interviewed over the years.
I guess knowing that eventually he's going to run out of time. So yeah, he becomes the secretary of the Māori historical movement, in a sense.
In these 20 years, Elsdon Best produced tens of thousands of pages worth of books and articles covering everything from Māori religion to traditional sports and games to technology to history and whakapapa. His most famous work is Tūhoe, Children of the Mist. These 2 volumes, first published in 1925, represented the most comprehensive written account of any Māori iwi at the time.
If Elsdon Best hadn't come in to write the history and the customs of Tūhoe, it would have been lost. it would have been just retained on the oral historical significance of our whakapapa, which that'll never go away because our whakapapa is carved on timber, on patterns, ko whaiwhai. But what he has done, he has put in a different aspects of telling the story of who is Tūhoe.
Elsdon Best's writings, based on his interviews with Tūhoe and other Māori rangatira, would remain arguably the most important written resource for people interested in the pre-European Māori world for much of the 20th century. We are talking about a guy who was never educated beyond a high school level and spent most of his life as a bush labourer. That's a pretty impressive achievement given the circumstances. But we should also remember the parts of his legacy which are less impressive. Because look, Elsdon Best made a good faith effort at recording and preserving a vast wealth of information which still has enormous value. But the way he interpreted and shared that information through his particular 19th century Pākehā lens has had consequences. And the worst example of that is what's now called the Moriori myth. Many people have probably already heard this myth and heard it debunked before, maybe even by me. But just for those who don't know, here's how it played out. Elsdon Best basically took fragments of stories which he heard about a tribe who'd supposedly lived in Te Urewera sometime in the distant past. He then combined those stories with his own personal observation that some Tūhoe people had what he described as negroid characteristics, things like frizzy hair and thick lips. Best then performed a pretty spectacular leap of logic to argue that this meant there must have been a population of Melanesian people who'd lived in Aotearoa, all over Aotearoa, before the ancestors of Māori turned up, and then Māori conquered and subjugated them. These imaginary pre-Māori inhabitants of Aotearoa were then conflated with Moriori, who are the real indigenous Polynesian people of Rekohu, the Chatham Islands. And even Elsdon Craig, who was pretty sympathetic generally towards his great-uncle, acknowledged that this was not his finest moment.
The theory rested on the flimsiest of evidence and was supported by somewhat irrational conjecture. Nor has it been entirely eradicated from the public mind. In spite of irrefutable evidence to the contrary, there are still many who talk confidently about a mysterious pre-Māori race of settlers.
And this is not the only controversial idea which Best was instrumental in pushing. He also developed a theory that Māori worshipped a supreme deity called Eor before Europeans arrived in Aotearoa, and that idea is pretty contentious these days, although there are some who believe it's true. He also promoted his friend Percy Smith's idea that all Māori ancestors landed in New Zealand as part of one big great fleet, whereas we now know they actually arrived aboard independent waka spread over many years. This has all been somewhat destructive to our understanding of Māori history and migration, but it wasn't necessarily meant to run Māori down. People like Elsdon Best were reacting to an older idea of Māori, the one promoted by people like Richard Taylor. And this told a story of degraded descendants of a lost tribe of Israel, shipwrecked on a distant island, people who'd forgotten the word of God and fallen into primitive worship of nature. Elsdon Best was constructing an alternative view of Māori. In his narrative, Māori were skilled seafarers with the bravery and technological know-how to cross the world's largest ocean. They were deep spiritual thinkers who developed a religion full of complex, abstract concepts, every bit as complex, and maybe more complex, than Christian religion. They were an expansive and warlike people who, at least according to him, had conquered these islands by force. In other words, Elsdon Best constructed a story of Māori which made them seem more like 19th century Europeans, and maybe because of that, more admirable to those Europeans. But at the same time, Best's construction of Māori placed them firmly in the past. Admirable maybe, but inferior, ultimately doomed to extinction. And just for an example of that, here's an extract from the introduction of Elsdon Best's first book, The Sea of Rippling Waters, his sort of tourist guide to Waikaremoana, published in 1897.
Primitive man, Neolithic man, has opened up the trails through the great forest he could not conquer. Trails by which the incoming pioneers of the Age of Steel shall pass along, to leave behind them peace in place of war, thriving hamlets for stockaded paths, fields of waving grain for jungle.
In his own book, Geoffrey Holman describes this sort of language as, and I quote, dignifying the takeover of Tūhoe lands under the cloak of crude evolutionary theory. But he says there's more to Elsdon Best's writing than that.
If you go through the very large body of work that he completed and had printed about Māori life and culture, there were negative comments in it, obviously, but the majority of it was not about putting Māori down. It was the intention was the complete opposite. And if you say, well, he was just patronising them anyway, yes, of course you can prove that by picking out these unpleasant and obviously racist references. But as well as being ahead of his time, Best was a man of his time. And for him to have been able to step outside that and have the psychology of the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s is something you can't ask of history.
Elsdon Best stayed fit and active right up until the final few years of his life. But age finally did catch up with him. In 1930, he suffered a stroke, put his writing work aside, and began to set his affairs in order. To his credit, he followed through on promises he'd made for taonga he'd been gifted by the people of Tūhoe to be sent back to Te Urewera. Elsdon Best died on September 9th, 1931. He was 75 years old. As for his legacy, well, for some, it's what was written in that E Tangata article.
Elsdon Best was a structural racist whose bigoted beliefs help explain a lot of the shit we're still dealing with today.
As we've seen, definitely some truth there. But for some others, there's another side to the story.
Elsdon Best brought Tūhoe into a world to allow them to maintain their tino rangatiratanga. And whatever he wrote can now be accessed by anyone around the world. If he hadn't done that, we would have accessed that information. And he did it well. He did it with patience, and he did it in a way that did not offend the people that he wrote about. That's very important. How did he do that? It's a 5-letter word called trust.
He was a human being like you and me. He had things going on inside which were never written about, things that he thought and felt, interior life, which he didn't project. And so to rob him of his humanity by calling him some kind of racist creep, who only wrote knockers about Māori, it misses the point that he was fully human and flawed, but he was also fully human and, I think, in some measure heroic. And I might get slammed for that, but I'm going to say it anyway. I respect him.
Very special thanks to my guests, Geoffrey Paparoa Holman and Hemana Waka. Geoffrey's book is The Best of Both Worlds, and if you want more on the stories of both Elsdon Best and Tūhoe, you should check it out. Hemana Waka's documentary is available via Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision. I'll include a link in the show notes. But unfortunately, you can't watch it online. You have to book a visit to go see it in person. If you enjoyed Black Sheep, make sure to follow us on your favourite podcasting app. You can also listen ad-free at rnz.co.nz. And while you're there, why not check out RNZ's other excellent podcasts? One I've been checking out recently is The Kakapo Files, Part 2. It has a dedicated, some would say obsessive following, of which I am one. So check that out, rnz.co.nz. Black Sheep was written and presented by me, William Ray. Our sound engineer is William Saunders, and our production coordinator is Brianna Uritich-Gregg. Our executive producer is Tim Watkin. Tim also doubled up as a voice actor this episode, alongside Edward Gay, Jeremy Parkinson, Tamamudu, Julian Wilcox, Te Urewera Fuapai, David Reed, and Pōkere Paiwai.